What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in this video, I'm going to make you guys an expert on the Green Goblin Norman Osborn, because he's going to be in Spider-Man 3, so why not go ahead and get this out of the way now. Now, here's the thing. This discussion is going to be on Norman. So, by and large, we are going to leave out Harry Osborn, unless what it is that Harry happens to be doing is pertinent to our discussion about Norman. So, Norman Osborn first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 14 in 1964, and he was created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Again, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were the ones who created really most of the iconic superheroes that you're aware of in Marvel Comics, but Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were the masterminds behind Spider-Man and pretty much all the early villains and characters that you know when it comes to his characters. Even the mainstays now, right, are basically all just Stan Lee, Steve Ditko creations. By and large, the appearances of Norman Osborn between issues 14 and 23 were really just him kind of appearing in the background or something like that, but never really doing anything major or significant. Now, the idea of him appearing in issue number 23 was actually based on a whole movie theater concept that for whatever reason that we didn't fully understand at the time and actually wouldn't understand for some number of issues later, the Green Goblin had it out for Peter Parker. And so the way this worked out was that operating behind the scenes, the Green Goblin basically got the works or got things in motion to create a movie about Spider-Man, and then Spider-Man was invited to be in the movie. This led to the Green Goblin attacking Spider-Man, initially under the auspices that it would be quote-unquote part of the movie, when the intention was to actually kill him. The other part was to get Peter Parker to kind of lower his defenses. Right now, again, at that point in time, Norman didn't know that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Instead, it was just the two of them fighting. Now, of course, Peter Parker gets the upper hand on Norman Osborn, and Norman Osborn is ultimately defeated, and that's where things get a little bit interesting. Because when you get into the actual origin of Norman Osborn, it's scattered all over the damn place. The origin of Norman Osborn is found in 3 locations. The first one is Spectacular Spider-Man Annual number 14, the second is Untold Tales of Spider-Man number 8, and the third is Amazing Spider-Man number 40, probably one of the most iconic Spider-Man issues, and we'll talk about why as we get closer to it. But with the Spectacular Spider-Man Annual and with Untold Tales, what you basically learn here is that between these two stories giving us this explanation that Norman Osborn's father was exceedingly abusive, but became abusive after turning to alcohol. And the reason why is that the Osborn family had a massive fortune that they had amassed since really the late 1800s. But Norman Osborn's father had basically invested the entirety of the family fortune in an invention that he was working on. Now, we're not given the details of it. In fact, as far as I'm aware, we don't know anything about it. All we know is the invention was stolen, and with it basically went pretty much the entirety of the Osborn fortune. And so after turning to alcohol, he became verbally abusive to his son and physically abusive to his wife. Now, ultimately, the mother of Norman Osborn dies. And when that happens, his father becomes even more abusive and actually starts sinking further into a depression. But one of the things that had happened is Norman Osborn's father had actually locked him in the abandoned Osborn mansion overnight in an effort to kind of toughen him up, right? Technically, in the comic, it was referred to as facing the darkness, but basically, one of the ways that Norman Osborn was depicted as a little kid is that he was kind of weak, right? That he was a little bit of a weakling of sorts. Now, really, his almost psychotic / sociopathic behavior towards humanity was rooted in his father's belief that in reality, the only person in this world that matters is yourself. And basically acquiring as much wealth as you can is the only thing that really matters. And so in the aftermath of this, and with Norman having been locked in that mansion, that he kind of begins this process of basically becoming the Green Goblin, right? In the sense that like this kind of darkness inside of him, this sort of laughing, cackling in the distance, that kind of a thing. That's what kind of sets the early stages for the Green Goblin mythos. Now, the reality and the reason why that happened is because by the time this story was written, you were already in the mid 1990s. And so coming off the stories of like Bill Mantlo and Peter David when it came to the Incredible Hulk, the idea of building this entire philosophy around the abusive nature of a father, and even more so than that, the early beginnings of a villain becoming a villain, kind of having a psychotic break, really taking place in their childhood, was huge, because that was the entire philosophy of the Incredible Hulk, right? That Bruce Banner was being abused by his father Brian, and that the idea of him becoming the Incredible Hulk when he was exposed to the gamma bomb, that was already on its way. Something would have happened somewhere along the line that led to Banner becoming the Hulk. In this instance, it just happened to be the gamma bomb. And the Hulk is a manifestation, at least in the early days, of all the rage he felt towards his father. And that's where the whole Green Goblin mythos kind of tied into the nature of Norman. Now, by the time you get to the conclusion of Spider-Man Annual number 14, one of the things that you learn here is that because of the fact that he was constantly ignored by his father and the frustration that came with it, when Norman Osborn had learned of a formula that was being developed by Wendell Strom that would basically enhance people, so kind of Wendell Strom's attempt to basically bring back the super soldier serum, that Harry Osborn, when Norman was experimenting with it, Harry Osborn had actually switched chemicals. And so there came a point when Norman Osborn went to conduct his experiment experiment, and everything went sideways. And in fact, the formula actually exploded in his face and started him down the process of bringing out all the insanity that he'd basically kept hidden, but it kind of been manifesting and growing ever since his childhood. Now, once you get into Untold Tales of Spider-Man number 8, one of the things you actually find out is that before Norman Osborn officially became the Green Goblin, he tried to kill Peter Parker. And the way this worked is that he had basically orchestrated things behind the scenes so that a movie would be made on the life of Spider-Man, and Spider-Man would be brought in to, of course, play the role of himself. Now, Norman, working behind the scenes, had actually sent in a couple of villains by the name of Headsman and Scorcher to try to take out Peter Parker. Of course, it didn't work. And so in response to this failure, Norman adopted the philosophy of saying if he wanted to have anything done, he had to do it himself. And that's when he started working on the mock-ups of the Green Goblin. All this goes into Amazing Spider-Man issue number 14, despite the fact that Spectacular Spider-Man Annual 14 and Untold Tales Spider-Man number 8 were written like 20 years after this, right? They were written 20 years after Amazing Spider-Man number 40. But Amazing Spider-Man number 40 was a hugely significant comic. Nobody knew who he was. The readers didn't know who he was. Nobody in the comics knew who the Green Goblin was. Peter Parker didn't know who the Green Goblin was. And in fact, there was actually a big fight between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko over how this was going to play out. Stan Lee wanted the Green Goblin to be Norman Osborn. Steve Ditko didn't. And the reason why is because in Steve Ditko's mind, things wouldn't just work out that way, where it turned out that the Green Goblin was somebody that Peter Parker had always known, right? It wouldn't just kind of be that happenstancy like of a situation. But in the mind of Stan Lee, it fit in perfect because it would give a kind of dramatic appeal that you really wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Steve Ditko wanted it to just be some swinging dick off the streets. That's really all he wanted to be, right? Just some random person that we'd never seen before. But because of the fact that Stan Lee usually always focused on the nature of interpersonal relationships in the early days of the comics, that again, Norman Osborn being the Green Goblin would have far more of an impact on the reader than just some random guy. And because Stan Lee was the editor, at least according to his interview with comicbook.com back in 2017, his response was, I'm going to be the one to do this, right? It's going my way. And so ultimately ended up being Norman Osborn who was the Green Goblin. And all this was revealed in Amazing Spider-Man number 40. Now, the way this worked is that Norman Osborn had actually developed a kind of substance that basically took out the spider sense of Peter Parker so Green Goblin could follow him, and then basically learned that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and in doing so, kidnapped him. And one of the things that you learn here is that the whole reason why Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin went after Spider-Man in the first place is because in the aftermath of everything that had happened with his father losing his fortune and all that kind of stuff, and basically Norman going insane, his desire was to rule the criminal underworld. But he couldn't just walk in and say, I'm Norman Osborn, I'm a great big huge corporate guy, I have way more money than like the Kingpin does, I want to run the criminal underworld. He had to do something to prove his worth. And in his mind, the best way to prove his worth as being the guy that's capable of running the criminal underworld is to kill Spider-Man. And that's why he always chased him. That's why he always went after him. Now, ultimately, in an effort to prove his superiority, he basically allowed Spider-Man to escape, right? Saying like, you're getting out of here with your life because I'm allowing it. And Peter Parker ended up defeating Norman Osborn anyway. But during that battle, Norman Osborn was thrown into a whole bunch of high voltage wires and ended up basically falling into a state of amnesia and essentially forgetting that he was ever the Green Goblin in the first place, which was really a way, it seemed, for Marvel to kind of introduce Green Goblin in issue number 23 and just basically kind of have him run as a character for about 17 issues and then close it out. Now, there's a couple reasons why, or at least I would kind of surmise there's a couple reasons why it happened this way. I don't really have any definitive answers. I have searched high and low. Harry Osborn didn't become the Green Goblin until Amazing Spider-Man 136, so it's not as though it was an interim period where Norman stopped being the Goblin and Harry took over instead. That didn't happen until much, much later. And so we can largely surmise a few things. The first is that it was a test bed. It was designed to ask the question, do fans really care about the Green Goblin, right? If we end it here, we basically write it out. Norman Osborn doesn't remember being the Green Goblin. That part of his memory's gone. He's forgotten everything after his son had basically gone to high school, and he kind of has to be rehabilitated. Peter Parker basically burns the Green Goblin costume. Are fans going to write in the letter pages and demand more Green Goblin stuff? Or are we never going to hear any requests about this guy? Because a Green Goblin didn't come back until about 56 issues later. And so because of that, whatever the reason happens to be, that Green Goblin was basically gone. When he did come back in issue number 96, that things were changed a little bit. Now, it wasn't as though some new writer had taken over and totally reworked the entire Green Goblin mythos. It didn't really happen that way. Instead, this was written by Stan Lee. Amazing Spider-Man issues 96 through 98, Stan Lee brought him back and then actually had the Green Goblin and Norman Osborn operating as a kind of multiple personality disorder sort of thing, where Green Goblin was actually his own character in the mind of Norman Osborn. And so there were times when Norman Osborn would be his normal self and then switch over to the Green Goblin. And the Green Goblin would be in control and then go forward forward and do his own thing. Now, there were some questionable things that happened during this point in time. You end up learning, for example, that Norman Osborn was in an affair with Gwen Stacy, which is probably one of the most reviled changes of the Spider-Man mythos, you know, depending on what Spider-Man fan you talk about. When I say depending on what Spider-Man fan you're talking to, precious few Spider-Man fans will say that they thought this was a good choice by Marvel. But the whole story of the Green Goblin really seemed to come to a head in Amazing Spider-Man issues number 121 and 122, when Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, was basically killed essentially by Peter Parker. Now, this story is probably one of the most significant stories ever published in the history of Marvel Comics and even comic books in general, because this story focused on the night Gwen Stacy died. And this was a big deal because at this point in time, and really up to this point in time, this never happened, right? I mean, this was written in 1971, and this was a story where Gwen Stacy was basically killed off by the Green Goblin, or Spider-Man killed Gwen Stacy himself, right? This is one of those things, you guys know the whole story, or you've seen some variation of the story. Gwen Stacy was at the bridge, and Peter Parker as Spider-Man went there to save her, and then she was knocked off the bridge by the Green Goblin, and then Peter Parker shot his webbing into her foot, and her neck cracks, and then the Green Goblin says she was already dead before you got here. So different things along those lines, right? So it's one of those things where it's kind of interpretive, and I don't even think Jerry Conway, the guy who wrote it, came out and said one way or the other. But regardless of the situation, the fact that Gwen Stacy died had two major impacts on Spider-Man. The first is that given all the rage and anger he had towards the Green Goblin, both because of the previous conflicts they had, the lengths the Green Goblin had went to turn Peter Parker's life upside down, as well as the fact that the Green Goblin, in the eyes of Peter Parker, had killed Gwen Stacy or created the circumstances under which Gwen Stacy was killed, Peter Parker lashed out, and basically the Green Goblin died in the process. Up to this point in time, in just comic books as a whole, not even Marvel Comics, but in comic books as a whole, there had never really been an instance where a superhero had failed so disastrously that their love interest died. That didn't happen. That never happened, right? We've talked about that before, that like Lois Lane could get knocked off the top of the building and she could be 100 feet from hitting the ground or an inch. It didn't matter, but Superman would always swoop in and save her in the nick of time. Gwen Stacy dying was landmark because it also taught Peter he couldn't be reckless, right? He couldn't go into situations where a member or anybody out there was in danger and be reckless with how he shot his webbing and kind of be distracted and things like that. He had to be hyper focused. And so as a result of that, the death of Norman Osborn, this really just like, I mean, this is one of those few instances. Marvel says, you know, it's gonna shake the comic book landscape to its core. Never believe Marvel Comics when they tell you that in this day and age. But back then, it actually did. This shook the entire comic book landscape in ways that were never thought possible. Because after this, things like Iris West in the Flash comics at DC, she was killed by Reverse Flash. This set the stage for the Dark Knight Returns, for Batman being dark and brutal. It really changed and introduced in a lot of ways the possibility that comic books themselves could just become darker and more brutal, because it just opened a door that had just never really been opened before. Now, of course, again, in the aftermath of this, Harry Osborn took vengeance against Peter Parker, and Harry Osborn ended up becoming the Green Goblin, basically taking up his father's mantle instead, which really continues on into a full-blown discussion about Harry himself. But as for Norman Osborn himself, his return came in a couple different forms. The first real official return of Norman Osborn was during Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man run at its conclusion with Spider-Man issue number 75. But the return of Osborn prior to his return in Spider-Man 75 was actually covered during the Osborn journals, or at least Osborn Journal number 1 in 1996. And what you end up learning here is that the entire events of the Clone Saga, right? So the idea of like Ben Reilly, Kane, Peter Parker, this whole thing with Miles Warren, the Jackal, the idea that Peter Parker might actually be the clone and Ben Reilly or Kane might be the actual Peter Parker, that all of that was basically spearheaded by Norman Osborn, who had returned due to the regenerative healing abilities that he gained by the same formula that made him into the Green Goblin. And so operating behind the scenes, the whole point of Norman Osborn as far as his role in the Clone Saga was to basically drive Peter Parker insane, to convince Peter Parker that he was an actual clone and to remove him from the entire landscape. The hope was to use Ben Reilly or Kane as basically a Spider-Man that would operate on behalf of Norman Osborn while he operated behind the scenes. But all this came to a head, of course, when the Clone Saga basically ended, and the Norman Osborn revealing himself in issue number 75 basically established that he was the mastermind behind the Clone Saga. He's the whole reason why the whole thing happened in the first place. place. Now, the truth about this is that the return of Norman Osborn for a lot of Spider-Man fans was cool. If you go back and you read the old letters pages that were being sent in, fans were happy to see Norman Osborn return. He was a character that people felt like had been missing from Marvel Comics for a long time, and the fact that he was missing just kind of left a gaping hole in the Spider-Man mythos. But fans were pissed about how he came back. They were like Clone Saga sucked, and you're gonna use this to bring back Norman Osborn? So fans were kind of pissed off about it. But at the end of the day, their anger towards the Clone Saga subsided, as anger towards pretty much any comic book story does, and people were just happy to have Norman Osborn back. But with Norman Osborn back on the scene, there were a few things that happened right off the bat, right? One of the things he did was he bought out the Daily Bugle, different things along those lines, trying to basically discredit or really embarrass J. Jonah Jameson, use the Daily Bugle as a way to kind of discredit Spider-Man to extreme degrees, in the way that J. Jonah Jameson just didn't really seem to have the heart to do himself. The reality, though, is that the real brunt of Norman Osborn returning took place in a bunch of different issues. The first one was Peter Parker's Spider-Man, which was really just a continuation of what Todd McFarlane had done. Of course, that part of the story taking place in issues 44 through 45, running all the way up to Amazing Spider-Man issue number 441, and even if we want to, 509 through 514. But the important thing here is that over the course of these various stories, a lot happened, right? A whole ton of stuff happened. So one of the first things to take place is that Norman Osborn basically tries to force Spider-Man to become his replacement. He drugs him, he puts the Green Goblin costume on him, that he actually ends up orchestrating situations where Peter Parker's friends are being attacked, all for the purpose of basically brainwashing Peter into believing that he is actually the Green Goblin. It doesn't work, right? And a fight breaks out and things just kind of go nuts, and then Peter Parker's just like, I don't want to do this anymore, declares a truce. During the Pulse comics, you actually end up finding out that Ben Urich from the Daily Bugle, a lot of you guys might remember him from the Civil War Frontline comics that we did back in the day, but basically kind of a mainstay reporter, really one of the big names when it comes to reporters in Marvel Comics, had actually ousted Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin publicly, and that the Green Goblin actually killed a reporter by the name of Terry Kidder. Now, one of the big things with this is that the entire launch of this, the entire defense of Norman Osborn was that it was a smear campaign, right? That they were basically trying to make Norman Osborn look like the Green Goblin for the purpose of just trying to get rid of him or get him out of the picture, whatever the case happened to be. But Luke Cage actually ended up confronting Norman Osborn when Norman Osborn had launched an attack against Jessica Jones and Spider-Man, with Jessica Jones being pregnant with Luke Cage's unborn kid. And so the result of this is that when Luke Cage confronted Osborn, despite the defense that Osborn had mustered for himself, he actually ended up attacking Luke Cage in front of the world, right? Cameras and all, in his goblin mask on his goblin glider. So that defense was totally out the window. There was no way for Norman Osborn to argue that he was not the Green Goblin, because he might as well have been walking around with giant purple letters on his head saying, I'm the Green Goblin, right? Like, that's basically what his actions amounted to. And all this basically goes into really the events of Civil War, running all the way up into Dark Reign. And the reason why this matters is because one of the events that took place during this point in time, and one of the big issues Marvel had to contend with, was Joe Quesada taking over as editor-in-chief. And we've talked about this before, that Quesada believed Spider-Man being married basically aged him. He wanted to minimize the idea that Spider-Man was older than he actually was, seemingly put Peter Parker in a place where they could write those kinds of stories for years and years and years and years, because if Spider-Man gets married, then that means Spider-Man's gonna have kids. And if Spider-Man's gonna have kids, that ages him, that makes him grow up. And if Spider-Man is having kids, can he really be a responsible superhero and have children at the same time? More so than that, new generations of fans are probably gonna want Spider-Man's kids to become his replacement. And so instead of having to worry about all those questions and answer even more questions, the idea of Spider-Man's marriage to Mary Jane Watson was completely nullified as part of the attempt of Joe Quesada to really consolidate and to restructure the entirety of Marvel Comics. And so this was a pretty big deal, because one of the things that had happened in the aftermath of this during the events of Spider-Man One More Day is that Norman Osborn did not know Peter Parker's identity, right? That's one of the things that had kind of happened as a result of this, is that it's really part of this, as well as part of Spider-Man One Moment in Time, as well as Brand New Day, kind of that trilogy, is that no one remembered anything. Whether it was because Doctor Strange modified the minds of everybody across all existence, or because Mephisto had changed reality himself, between these stories, nobody knew that Peter Parker was actually Spider-Man. And so during this time, as part of the events going into Civil War, what you actually had is the Thunderbolts, right? The formation and really the newest iteration of the team, led by Baron Zemo, and Green Goblin was brought on as part of the Thunderbolts. Now the reality, and really for anybody who was reading Civil War at the time, Norman Osborn seemed like a character that didn't need to be on the Thunderbolts because he was bigger than that. And in a lot of ways it made sense, right? The Thunderbolts was kind of a poor man's evil Avengers team, is really what it was, right? It's kind of a cheap knockoff. And so because because of that, people were kind of like, this doesn't make any sense. But the point was not to put Norman Osborn on the Thunderbolts and leave him there indefinitely. The point was to put him on the Thunderbolts as a reason to, one, get him out of jail, and two, get him into the intelligence community. The reason for that is because going into the events of Secret Invasion, where the Skrulls had basically started replacing superheroes and humanity, government officials, things like that, with Skrull replacements in an effort to conquer the world as a result of Galactus destroying the Skrull homeworld, this led to Norman Osborn actually intercepting information that would basically lead to the defeat of the Skrull race during Secret Invasion, which he used. Now, during this point in time and in the aftermath of Civil War, Iron Man was director of S.H.I.E.L.D. But because Secret Invasion had happened, it had led the intelligence community to question the ability of Iron Man to be an effective leader if S.H.I.E.L.D. serves the purpose of monitoring Earth for threats. And Iron Man didn't know that the Skrulls were replacing superheroes and people with Skrull replicants. The result of this is that, and really one of the coolest stories, really one of the coolest publishing initiatives that Marvel had done, this led to Iron Man being removed as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Norman Osborn put in Iron Man's place as the new director. And this initiated what we call Dark Reign. Dark Reign was an amazing line of comics. God, I love Dark Reign. Now, it was not a real story per se. It was not like you go and you read Dark Reign, you get Dark Reign parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It doesn't work that way. Instead, the way this played out is that with Norman Osborn as director of S.H.I.E.L.D., because the Superhuman Registration Act was still in effect, meaning any superheroes that didn't register with the federal government were being hunted down by the government itself, specifically S.H.I.E.L.D., or at least Hammer as it was now called under Osborn. Most superheroes who were already registered basically ended up defecting, right? They basically went underground and essentially joined Captain America's Secret Avengers. Those individuals who had already refused to register were already underground as part of Captain America's Secret Avengers. And so Dark Reign saw a huge shift because one of the things that you saw is that in the absence of traditional superheroes, that Norman Osborn had actually started creating dark versions of superheroes. And so you ended up having the Dark Avengers, which were basically villains playing the role of the superheroes. You had the Dark X-Men, which were villains playing the role of the X-Men, because the X-Men themselves had actually left the United States. They had taken residence up on an island off the coast of San Francisco that was quote unquote outside the jurisdiction of the United States and by extension Norman Osborn. But for Osborn himself, he ended up basically taking up the Iron Man mantle and then rechristening himself as the Iron Patriot, and then literally just launching a campaign to basically conquer the entirety of the United States, all under the guise of national security, right? And so basically what this did is it led to a really cool situation where for the most part, it was just kind of like Osborn himself. The Green Goblin kind of seemed to be out of the picture, but not really. It was this concept that was kind of lingering in the background, and you knew that it was there, but you didn't really see it as like a major focal point. The only real time that you would see it crop up is, for example, when the Sentry Robert Reynolds was being enlisted by Norman Osborn, and Norman Osborn used his history, specifically his multiple personality disorder aspect of the Green Goblin, to kind of empathize with Robert Reynolds and to say, I know where you're coming from, work with me and we'll find a way to basically take care of this, right? Just things along those lines. And so all this basically led to Norman Osborn creating things like the List, which was basically like literally a hit list, people that he wanted to have taken out, various threats and things like that were going to be eliminated. And then it all basically came to a head in Siege on Asgard. And Siege on Asgard is a story that we have covered, and it was basically the whole idea that Norman Osborn saw Asgard in Broxton, Oklahoma as the last real holdout, that if he was able to conquer that, he would in effect have any real major threat to his dominance over the United States completely eliminated. Now, as we saw with Siege on Asgard, that Loki, who had actually joined Osborn, turned against him and then tried to find a way to help the Asgardians win, only for the Sentry Robert Reynolds to lose his mind, become the Void. Norman Osborn lost control of him. The Goblin personality started coming back. Like literally, it hit the fan fast. Everything that could go wrong for Norman Osborn did. And basically the superheroes ended up winning. Norman Osborn was defeated and thrown in jail when it was revealed that he had engaged in like all these real criminal elements in order to solidify his power, which he had actually successfully managed to keep hidden from a lot of government officials. Now the truth is, even the White House was getting wind of what Osborn was doing, but they would give him a little bit of a leash because in the aftermath of Stanford, the launch of the Superhuman Registration Act, the superheroes needed to be curtailed. And the point that Osborn had made is it takes a firm hand to defeat a firm firm foe, and the superheroes have to be reeled in, and I'll do whatever I need to do. So he was kind of given that leniency. Siege on Asgard was going too far, and that's why you ended up seeing the federal government and even the superheroes all turning against Osborn, which is what led to his defeat. Now, following this, there were a few things that went on in Avengers Volume 4, but it was really more of Marvel just kind of doing cleanup duty in the aftermath of Dark Reign, right? Like Norman Osborn escaping, trying to reform Hammer, ultimately being defeated, and then being thrown back in jail again, and that kind of a thing. And that was really it, right? Things wrapped up pretty readily with Norman Osborn, and you saw a few stories in the aftermath: Goblin Army, Rise of the Red Goblin, different things like that. There was one point where he was trying to get Superior Spider-Man to work on his behalf, different things along those lines. But in truth, a lot of this was really just Norman Osborn kind of operating behind the scenes, especially during Goblin Army, trying to create an army for himself, using the forces of the Jackal, different things along those lines. But the Rise of the Red Goblin is really where he became a lot more interesting. And the reason for this was because at the end of the Goblin Army, Peter Parker had basically defeated Norman Osborn by injecting him with a serum that was basically a cure to the Goblin persona. So it basically got rid of the Green Goblin. That's more or less what seemed to happen. And Norman Osborn had gone back to having a life of sanity. Now, during Rise of the Red Goblin, he had tried to bring back the Goblin Army, but none of it really seemed to work. And when he tried to re-inject himself with the Goblin formula, that didn't work either. And so essentially, he had lost his ability to become the Green Goblin, was now completely depowered. This basically saw him turning to what was in effect the Carnage symbiote, and then basically becoming a version, or at least the newest version, of Carnage. On top of that, when the Green Goblin persona returned as a result of the Carnage symbiote, then you basically had the Green Goblin with the power of Carnage, which was crazy because it was like insanity times 2. It was a really cool story. We're not going to go super in-depth into this because we're actually going to cover it here on this channel as part of our really continuation of concluding Dan Slott's Spider-Man run, which we never actually did. But it was a really, really good story. It was an amazing story. But all that really spearheaded and really segued into the events of Absolute Carnage. Because Norman Osborn had been in possession of a symbiote, it had basically left what we refer to as a codex, basically like a little piece of the symbiote inside his genetic structure, and that Carnage was traveling around trying to gather all these codexes for the purpose of making himself more powerful to defeat Null, the symbiote god, the person responsible for creating all the symbiotes. As we covered during the events of Absolute Carnage, that Norman Osborn is one of the people who was defeated. He was one of those people who was overtaken by Cletus Cassidy. And the result of this is that he was kind of conscripted into the forces of Cletus. Now, in the aftermath of that, and with the Absolute Carnage event basically wrapping up, by and large, you actually ended up seeing Norman Osborn fall to the background. Because in the aftermath of Absolute Carnage, it went directly into the King in Black, which was really a Venom story, right? It was really just the story of Eddie Brock kind of, again, completing his redemption arc, fully becoming a good guy, and quite literally saving the universe. So yeah, right now, things are a little murky with regards to Norman Osborn. We don't really know exactly what direction he's going to go in, exactly what his character is going to look like. It's still kind of unfolding and sort of progressing, right? So we're basically in the middle of a story arc. We won't really know until it concludes. But yeah, I mean, these are kind of the broad strokes of Norman Osborn, right? You're talking about a guy who's been around since 1964, right? This guy's been around for a long, long time. So about 58 years. Kind of hard to cram everything about a character from 58 years into a single video. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.